What's up guys, this is Desm101. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Sega Saturn, my favorite console ever. And how we're going to be doing that is taking a look at a bunch of the racing games from the console. Now the Sega Saturn might not have been a strong 3D console, but it still was able to put out some really great games. So we're going to have a look at a majority of the racing games on the console, and I'm going to give you a rating to let you know what I think and how the games rank against each other. So let's go ahead and check those out. So of course, there's no other game that we could start with besides Daytona USA, the classic from 1995 that was released with the debut of the Sega Saturn in the US. And this was a game I played first for the Sega Saturn, so it's always going to be synonymous with the system for me. And overall, it's a pretty good experience. It was rushed, however, and you can tell that the development was not properly finished because the technical difficulties of the game, such as the pop-in, the low polygon count, and the frame rate. So they, of course, couldn't be able to match what was on the arcade system at the time by AM2, the original, but it still does a faithful port here. And you also have the Saturn mode, which gives you the option to play as this other car, which actually is a little bit better to control, and it's still a lot of fun to play. So this is really still a great game, and it retains that arcade feeling, though there are some shortcomings in this version. Sega followed up with Daytona USA Championship Circuit Edition, which is an update to the original game that adds more polish, similar to how they did with Virtua Fighter Remix. And this game definitely has some improvements over the original as far as the appearance and the controls of the game, but the music is a little different. They've removed some of the vocals from the songs, so you get kind of an edited remix. And overall, the game is still a lot of fun, though it doesn't feel like it has quite as much personality as the first game. The designs on the cars are kind of bland and boring, and it just doesn't quite feel like a Daytona USA game. There is a couple of tracks added though, and if you're a fan of the series, I definitely recommend checking this one out. But I don't think it's the best version of this game. Up next is the classic Sega Rally Championship. Now this game is a fan favorite for very obvious reasons. It's got some great polish, some excellent gameplay, and it just keeps you coming back for more. Now this is really the height of those arcade racing games, and Sega just did a phenomenal job porting this game over. It came out in 1995, and there's just a lot here to talk about. It's one of those games that you can just kind of keep gushing on and on about. There's a good variety between the two cars that you can pick at the start, and there are some unlockables, as well as the different time trial modes. It's definitely a game that you want to check out if you're a fan of racing games on the Saturn. And it went on to spawn a very large series. This is an example of an early Sega sports title, and it's also notable because it had the license for Toyota and Lancia in the game, which lends itself really well to a bit of realism. And it's one of those games that you just want to keep coming back for more, trying to get your times better, trying to improve the way that you handle the cars. It's just very addictive arcade gameplay at its best.
Caution, hairpin right. Long, medium left, checkpoint.
Sega Touring Car Championship is a lesser-known title by Sega on the Sega Saturn, based on an arcade game again. And this time you're racing in touring cars. So this game suffers from a few things. It has some great presentation, but the controls are very troublesome to get the hang of. It seems like they were going for more of a sim gameplay style of feel, but it just comes across as very frustrating when you're trying to figure out how to control this game. And the presentation is somewhat lacking. It doesn't quite have the same graphical abilities, and there's lots of warping on the textures, especially near the camera. It almost looks like there's a giant black hole following the car. So it's just kind of an oddity. It was developed by AM Annex, released in 1997. Now, a lot of these games you can also use the Sega Racing stick, although I don't have one. Most of them are compatible with that, including this game. But probably not a game that I'd recommend. Up next is some Sega Ages titles, ports of the arcade games, which are really fun racing games, Outrun and Power Drift. Now these were some very impressive ports and very accurate to the arcade original, plus it's just a great way to play these games. So in comparison, if you try to run Outrun or Power Drift on MAME, for example, it's really a big pain trying to set up the controls to work properly. So having the ability to play this on the Sega Saturn with the joystick or with the Saturn pad really helps out a lot, and it's just an excellent way to run these games. I remember them in the arcade all the time, and it always brings up a lot of fondness. It's that classic Sega scaler style and that perfect arcade atmosphere again, just kind of Sega flexing their arcade muscle. And these games still hold up very well, even though by this point when it was released on the Saturn they were already a few years old. But because the Sega arcade hardware was so powerful, it took a few generations for the systems to be able to run it at home. So definitely recommend these ones. Now here is a lesser known title, Gale Racer, only released in Japan. And this is a pretty interesting game. It's actually a port of the arcade game Radmobile, which was notable for being the first appearance of Sonic the Hedgehog as a figure hanging from the rearview mirror there. So this isn't a bad game. It's still pretty fun. It has a similar kind of presentation to Power Drift with those kind of logs on scaling. But it's really challenging and not quite as fun as a lot of the other racers on the system. It just feels a lot more like a 16-bit racer. But it's not bad. It's definitely worth checking out if you're a fan of Sega racing games. Here's a game that's seen far more ports, and that's Virtua Racing. And this one is technically Time Warner Interactive's VR Virtua Racing. Kind of a long title, and it's definitely the black sheep of the series. Most people would consider the 32X version to be superior. The Sega Saturn version runs pretty okay, It doesn't really add much to the graphical capabilities, which I like. You know, it kind of sticks true to the original look of the flat shaded polygons. It adds a few things like a Grand Prix mode with a few new courses and some new vehicles that you can drive. And I still think it's a pretty great game. It's one that I could talk about for a long time. But it just is lacking in some of the control areas, some of the hit detection. Frame rate drops back and forth. So it just doesn't hold up quite as well as the 32X version. We'll leave it at that. From EA, it's Andretti Racing, which also saw a PC and PS1 release. Did have a good look here on the Sega Saturn. Though the graphics weren't super complex and detailed, they held up pretty well and give you a nice sense of speed. This game is also noted for having a large amount of courses to play on, which was pretty big difference compared to stuff like Virtua Racing and Daytona USA. The career mode also fleshed out the package, although it took up some 400 blocks of memory space, which would use up most of the Saturn's internal memory. But this one is a pretty good racing game, and one that I do recommend to check out if you like these old school racers on the Saturn. Next is a Saturn exclusive F1 challenge, in which you can play through the 1995 F1 season with a selection of racers and their cars. And this game definitely rides the fine line between simulation and arcade, leaning more towards the arcade side, but offering some neat little elements like editing the car options and adjustments and things like that. It looks pretty good graphically, and is quite a bit of fun to play due to the easy to get the hang of controls. So this is another game that holds up pretty well on the Sega Saturn and is worth coming back to every so often. Alright, here is another Sega Saturn exclusive, GT24 from Jaleco in 1998. And this is based off of their Super GT24 arcade game, and it's a okay port. It's kind of a average game, I would say. It lacks detail. It runs okay. It's okay to control, but it just doesn't feel like it has a lot of depth to it, and it just feels a little boring after a while. This is one of those games that kind of shows the age of the Saturn and its 3D capabilities. Not much more than a curiosity, in my opinion. Here we have High Velocity Mountain Racing Challenge. That's quite a mouthful. And it's from Cave, who is far more known for their shooter games. And this is based on Japan-style one-on-one mountain racing, or Touge Racing. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Touge. But yeah, it's a pretty decent game that's actually quite a bit of fun to play. It's not bad. It doesn't really have much to impress you with as far as looks, but still it's a fun game to pop in and try out. And this was called Touge King the Spirits in Japan. This is the US version of that, and there was a sequel which was released, Touge King of Spirit 2, that wasn't ever put out here in the US, which we won't be looking at that sequel today, unfortunately. And to round out the group of racing games that we're looking at today, we're going to have a couple futuristic racers. And what a better one to start with than Wipeout. And this is a port of that original PlayStation 1 game by Tantalus. who actually did a pretty good job on it. It looks accurate and it plays pretty similar to the PlayStation 1 version, although it only runs at 20 frames per second. It's still a really fun game, but it lacks some of the music as well, which wasn't able to be licensed for this version. So, for a couple reasons, like the frame rate and the music, it definitely trails behind the PlayStation 1 version. But on the Saturn, this makes an impressive game, a racing game. And I wanted to also mention the sequel, Wipeout 2097, or Wipeout Excel, which did not get a release in the US. It was released in Europe as Wipeout 2097 and in Japan in Wipeout Excel. And this one improves on just about everything that was wrong in the first game from the Saturn version, and again handled by Tantalus. And this one really holds up well, and in my opinion is one of the most impressive games on the Sega Saturn as far as 3D goes. It did a fantastic job handling the graphics, and this is released in 1997 in Europe and 1998. And this is probably the most interesting port of Wipeout Excel. Definitely worth checking out.
Missile.
Now here's a real oddity. This is Scorcher, developed by Zyrinx, who also developed Red Zone and Subterraria on the Sega Genesis, which you might know them better from. And it's also considered one of the rarest Saturn releases in Japan, which I couldn't find a lot of information on it. But yeah, this game generally looks pretty cool. It has a kind of futuristic dark feeling to it, but the game just plays terribly. And it feels like the controls just weren't really implemented or thought through very well. So you can have a jump, but the turning is really awkward. You're supposed to press additional buttons while you're turning, even on some very simple turns, and if you don't do it right, you always fall off the track. So it just feels really frustrating trying to figure this game out, and to me it kind of comes across as a little more than a tech demo. Lastly, we have Cyber Speedway from 1995, and this is somewhat of a story-based futuristic racer from Sega. It's actually a spiritual sequel to Cyber Race, which was originally on the PC, which definitely had more emphasis on the story as well. It has simple gameplay and graphics. The story is kind of overly long-winded and somewhat uninteresting, leading up to basically what is an average game overall. The ship sled designs were designed by Sid Mead, the guy who designed the futuristic look of the cars and stuff in Blade Runner, for example, and a ton of other art and production designs. He's really well known. But I don't think the design came across so great in the development process, and the game has a lot of pop-in. It just kind of fails to impress looks-wise, and fairly simplistic concepts, like you can't even pick a different ship. You just start off with this one ship that you can't really have different ships, so it's just somewhat lacking in my opinion. Feels pretty average. Another weird thing is the music on this US version was by Bygone Dogs, and it definitely has this hardcore 90s jam band kind of feel, which is kind of clashing with the game at times, which is trying to be very futuristic. That's kind of funny. Okay, so I wanted to go ahead and give you my ranking of these games through a tier list, as you see here. And what we have at the top is Wipeout 2097 and Sega Rally Championship. And I think these are the most technically competent games that really impress and have that wow factor, as well as the deep, engaging gameplay, and just kind of round out the whole package and what you'd want from a racing game, especially on the Sega Saturn. And in the A tier, we have Andretti Racing, F1 Challenge, Power Drift, and Outrun. These are all solid choices, and I think have a lot of great gameplay. They don't stand out too much from each other, but they're still excellent games and quite worth your time. In the B tier, we have Virtua Racing, Daytona USA, Daytona USA Championship Circuit Edition, and Wipeout. These are all games that I think have a lot of fun gameplay and that hold up really well, but they're just lacking in one way or another. They have some kind of gameplay issue or some kind of technical or graphical issues, so that kind of keeps them in this tier. In the C tier, we have High Velocity Mountain Racing and Sega Touring Car. These are okay games that are basically, in my opinion, average. Worth checking out if you're a fan of racing games or a fan of the Saturn, but not really that great. And then we have Cyber Speedway and GT24 in the D class. These are games that are below average, in my opinion, that just kind of fail to have any lasting good impression. Ones that you probably want to not really look for unless you're mostly curious. And lastly, in the E tier, we have Scorcher, which is really not a fun game to play, in my opinion. I did try giving this one a chance. It has some good music, but overall, it's just not a very good game. It doesn't go straight to the bottom of the list, though, because it does have some pretty good music, and because it is kind of impressive looking in the graphics department. That's probably the only saving element for that game. All right, so tell me what you guys think. What are your favorite racing games on the Saturn, and do you agree with how I've listed them here in my tier list? Let me know. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next time. Have a good one.
Missile. Miles. Missile. Electrobolt. Shield energy low.